Hello everybody, I'm Alison and I wanted to speak about the Sex Discrimination Act and the Private Members Bill, the second one, that proposes to define men and women in rather narrow biological terms. And recently, Senator Michaelia Cash made headlines by arguing that transgender women cannot become pregnant and therefore questioning how anti-discrimination protections relating to pregnancy could apply to them. Well, first let me say this. I believe that the Act does need reform, but not the reform these people are proposing. So let me come back to this statement about questioning how anti-discrimination protections relating to pregnancy could apply to them. And let me first say this. It doesn't apply to them any more than anti-discrimination against black people applies to white people. Okay, nobody's proposing that it does. The protections are there for people who become pregnant. Those people, as you'll discover, might be women. So, anyway, I think Michaelia Cash misses the point entirely, and I think, in fact, this is a really good example of a broader political tactic that we're seeing more and more often, particularly from the right. Rather than discussing the purpose of anti-discrimination law, politicians pick an unusual or emotionally charged example, present it as absurd, and then use the example to undermine the broader principle. The question was never really about pregnancy. The question is whether people should be protected from discrimination. The purpose of anti-discrimination law is not to determine who can become pregnant, it's to prevent people from being unfairly treated, excluded, harassed, or disadvantaged because of who they are. And that's where I think this debate has gone completely off the rails. The Sex Discrimination Act already protects Australians from discrimination on the basis of gender identity, sexual orientation, and intersex status. In other words, despite its name, it has evolved far beyond a simple law about biological sex. The law recognises something that most people understand from lived experience. Discrimination doesn't happen because someone checks your chromosomes. Discrimination happens because of how you are perceived. A transgender woman can be denied employment, housing, services, safety, or dignity because she's perceived as a cisgender woman or because she does not conform to somebody else's expectations of gender. The discrimination is real regardless of her reproductive capacity. So when politicians focus on whether a transgender woman can become pregnant, they're focusing on an edge case while ignoring the broader purpose of the legislation. The real question should be this. Would the proposed changes strengthen protections against discrimination or would they weaken them? And the answer is they weaken them. Because if the practical effect of these reforms is to reduce protections that transgender Australians currently enjoy under the law, then we need to be honest about that. We should also be asking whether the name of the Act itself reflects its modern purpose, and I argue it doesn't. The vast majority of discrimination that people experience today is not based on medical examination of their biological sex. It's based on perceived gender. It's based on how people are perceived, how they present, and how society responds to them. That's why I believe it's time to have a serious conversation about modernising the Sex Discrimination Act. Not to remove protections for women, not to weaken protections for anyone, but to recognise that discrimination in the 21st century is often about gender identity and gender and expression, and that our laws should reflect that reality. Because the purpose of anti-discrimination law should never be to exclude people. Its purpose should be to ensure that every Australian is treated with dignity, fairness and respect. And that's a principle worth defending. Perhaps it's time we stopped arguing about unusual hypothetical examples, Michaelia Cash, and started asking whether our anti-discrimination laws reflect the realities of discrimination in modern Australia, and I argue they don't. And there's another problem with Michaelia Cash's argument. She repeatedly talks about who can and cannot become pregnant as though the answer is obvious. But that depends entirely on how you're defining the words man and woman. And she will happily swap back and forth between the definition she wants and the definition that, if you like, exists to make political points. But if you define a man as someone who identifies and lives as a man, then men can and do become pregnant. Transgender men exist. Some retain a biological capacity to become pregnant. Some have given birth. That's a simple fact. What's interesting is that many anti-trans political arguments almost never mention transgender men. The debate focuses almost exclusively on transgender women. So now, for those of you who aren't familiar with the definitions, right, a transgender man is, if you like, someone who's transitioned from assigned female at birth to male. Transgender woman is someone who's been assigned male at birth, transitions to female. All right? So that's what we're talking about here. And it's interesting that these political arguments never mention transgender men. Why? Because transgender women are politically useful. They're easier to present as controversial. They're easier to turn into a cultural battleground. Meanwhile, transgender men often disappear from the conversation entirely because the fact that their existence complicates many of the simplistic claims being made. When politicians tell us that men cannot become pregnant, what they're often really saying is that they've chosen a particular definition of the word man, and they're presenting that definition as though it settles the entire debate. It doesn't. It simply reveals that the debate is not nearly as simple as they're pretending. And look, let's stop pretending this is about pregnancy. Let's stop pretending this is about biology. And let's stop pretending this is about legal clarity. The Sex Discrimination Act has protected gender identity for years. Nobody was rushing to change it. When a transgender woman successfully relied on those protections in the Giggle versus Tickle case, suddenly we're told there's a crisis. Suddenly we're told the law is absurd. Suddenly we're told biological reality is under attack. I don't buy it. What I see is a familiar political pattern. Take an unusual case, turn it into a national controversy, focus public attention on an emotionally charged example rather than the broader principle, create an outrage. Then use that outrage to justify reduced protections that already exist. We've seen versions of this strategy used against all sorts of minority groups throughout history. The target simply changes. The playbook doesn't. And that's why I think Michaelia Cash's comments matter, not because of what they tell us about pregnancy, but because of what they tell us about the political project that's unfolding around transgender Australians. The real question isn't whether a transgender woman can become pregnant. The real question is why a successful discrimination case involving a transgender woman has triggered such a determined effort to redefine the law. Because from where I sit, it looks a lot less like a debate about biology and a lot more like a debate about whether transgender Australians should continue to enjoy the protections they currently have under Australian law. And lastly, Michaelia Cash is a senior politician. She's had years of exposure to these debates. She understands that transgender Australians are a vulnerable minority. She understands that anti-discrimination protections affect real people's lives. She understands that the outcome of these debates will affect whether transgender Australians enjoy equal protection under the law. And despite that, she's chosen to focus on an edge case, characterise it as absurd, and support reforms that critics argue would weaken existing protections. Therefore, she should be held responsible for the foreseeable consequences of those choices. I believe these politicians know exactly what they're doing. I believe the consequences are foreseeable, and I believe they should be judged accordingly.